Hello. Today we are going to talk about the judicial process and policymaking. One of the questions that I get quite often from students as we are learning about the Supreme Court, and even as we're studying civil liberties and civil rights, since we're talking about court cases, is how does a case even make it to the Supreme Court? Like, how does that actually happen? I mean, guys, your odds are not good that if you go to court and you lose your lawsuit, or win, quite frankly, and somebody challenges it for appeal, that your case is ever going to make it, quote unquote, all the way to the Supreme Court, right? That phrase, all the way to the Supreme Court, which, by the way, doesn't happen quickly. So how does a case even get there? Well, let me rephrase something. So when we talk about the Supreme Court taking a case, or when a case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, that means it's granted cert. Now, why cert? First of all, it's cert, C-E-R-T. Cert is short for the writ of certiorari, which is a fancy legal Latin term, and most of the rest of us just call it cert. So how is a case granted cert? Well, first of all, we need to begin with cases starting at the district level that are federal cases, or at the state level in local communities that come from state for state violations that have emerged. So a case almost all the time comes to the Supreme Court through the appellate system. Appellate is the fancy word for to appeal. That means that somebody is not happy with what happened in the case, and so they've chosen to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. And just because you ask for an appeal does not mean that the Supreme Court is going to grant you cert. I mean, goodness sakes, you can ask for things all the time, but it does not mean that you are going to get them. Well, the court operates that same way. You can say, Mrs. Condit, is there a way that we could meet in person for the rest of the year and work through these wonderful lectures? And I go, that's a great idea. Not going to happen. State laws and all. So how do we manage that? How does a case actually get granted cert? So the Supreme Court tends to grant cert to cases that involve civil liberties. Oh, you guys, they love those civil liberties cases. That's why there were so many of them for us to talk about. They oftentimes grant cert on cases where there's a conflict amongst the lower courts, like the third district or the third circuit court ruled this way on an issue that's very similar to how the Ninth Circuit ruled the total opposite way on the same issue. So that's a problem. So the Supreme Court will oftentimes pick up those cases or grant them cert if there's a conflict in how the circuit courts are operating or a conflict on how district courts are operating. They want to iron those out so that the law is really clear. So they see themselves as sort of the decision maker in those circumstances. If they see that the district court has ruled differently on something that the U.S. Supreme Court has, they, again, want to iron out those differences. And so they'll grant a case cert on that area. Or maybe you have an area of the law that is not really clearly defined. So I'll go back to an example I've used previously in the year about freedom of speech on social media sites. Can you say certain things on social media sites, or is it perceived as hate speech? Is that a monitored form of speech regardless of where you say it? And so that's a good question. And social media is kind of a new thing. And so the court has to examine that and think a little bit about that. The case of Citizens United versus FEC, right? The Supreme Court had to look at this example of like, okay, if I make a 90-minute film, which is really an ad, if I'm the filmmaker and the PAC that created the film, then do I get free speech? Do I have the right to make that film, or does that violate FEC regulations, right? That's a new area of the law that the Supreme Court had never dealt with before. So they had to address it. There was a case 2 years ago in front of the court called Carpenter versus United States, which was about trying to ping your location based off of what cell phone towers your cell phone pinged off of most recently. And so, like, that's a new area of the law, something completely different that the court has to look at. And so those sometimes are cases that the court likes to pick up and grant cert for because it's just new and interesting and could lead to some future legal issues. So they tend to pick up cases like that. There's also certain groups that have influence. So let's say that the NAACP has decided to weigh in on a case that is up for cert at the Supreme Court, right? That's all the way to the Supreme Court and waiting for the Supreme Court to go, yep, let's listen to that one. Well, the NAACP is a very powerful interest group. And so they carry a lot of weight behind them. If they decide to file what's called an amicus brief, sometimes called an amicus, it just depends. I've heard both from lawyers who've argued in the Supreme Court. So if the NAACP, files a brief on behalf of one of the sides in the case, but you know what? Then the Supreme Court might be like, oh, that's interesting. Boy, why is the Supreme Court filing a brief on this issue? Or the NAACP filing a brief on this issue? Oh, the ACLU is really interested in this topic, huh? They've decided to weigh in. That the Supreme Court will take that very seriously. And consider granting that case cert. If the Solicitor General of the United States is really, really interested in a case, then the Solicitor General might write an amicus brief. And if he or she does that, well, then the court is really going to be interested too. It means that the federal government is interested in this case and has something at play. So how does the court actually make a decision? Well, that's a more complicated topic than we have time for in the context of short screencasts. But what I would tell you is that when the court has to make a decision, they weigh a couple things. They weigh precedent, meaning okay, what's happened in the past? And then they weigh what's called stare decisis. And I think we talked about stare decisis before in Unit 3, but stare decisis is keeping the decision to stand, or actually means let the decision stand. What does that really mean? It means this is settled law. We're not going to overturn that decision. So I'll give you an example. Plessy versus Ferguson, right? We have the Supreme Court saying it's okay to have separate but equal facilities. So when the Supreme Court, flash forward 60 years after that, gets Brown versus Board of Education, they could have said, okay, we're just going to hang on to stare decisis. We're going to say the court's already said that separate but equal is okay. It's perfectly okay to allow schools to segregate students as long as the facilities are equal. Or they could go, you know what, we're going to overturn stare decisis. We're not going to let the decision stand. We're going to overturn that decision. So the court tends to lean on stare decisis more than not. They rely on precedent, which is past practice. But there are occasions when they do overturn decisions. What else does the court have to do to make a decision? Well, they have to have oral arguments. And if you were one of the students who listened to oral arguments over the past couple weeks, then you know what they sound like and what they look like. Each side gets approximately 30 minutes to make their case. And the entire time that they are arguing their case, the justices are interrupting them. That is normal. If you watched it over the past 2 weeks, you might have been surprised, oh, how rude to be interrupted. But that is, in fact, common practice. You can be mid-sentence. It doesn't matter. And the expectation is that the lawyer who is arguing the case for that side will immediately answer the question. And if the justice doesn't think that the question has been fully answered, they'll push back even more so. They'll ask for examples. We saw that over the past few weeks. So they need some information in order to make a decision. Our justices heavily rely upon their clerks to help inform them of precedents. It's their clerks who do the research, clerks who take notes on things for them. The justices have a lot on their plate, and so they hire clerks whose job it is to kind of assist them in this process. So the justices will ask their clerks, what does past practice say? What are the types of questions? Where are the holes in the case? You have to be a pretty smart cookie in order to clerk for a Supreme Court justice. So after the court goes through oral arguments, and they're doing this right now with the cases that we heard over the past few weeks, but after the court goes through oral arguments, they then immediately go to conference. And they conference in the conference room. It's a really big room, really, really big room. And they just sit there and it's just them, all 9 justices. Nobody else is allowed. No clerks, no one. And the junior justice, that means the person who is newest to the court, in this case, that's Justice Kavanaugh, is in charge of answering the door, getting things. They kind of serve as the hired help. So for the most part, everybody has to serve as junior justice at some point in time. Justice Gorsuch only had to be junior justice for about 1.5 years before Justice Kavanaugh came in. So he didn't have that job for a very long time. But the justices sit in the room and they take a like knee reaction vote. Like, what's your gut say? And if based on that, they kind of decide, okay, here's what we want to do. They assign somebody to write the majority opinion, and they write, if there's a dissent, they assign the senior justice decides in the dissent, decide who's going to write the dissent. So let's say, for example, we have the case of Condit versus Kiefer. And we have arguments, and the Supreme Court has heard our arguments, and now they're going to go to conference and make a decision in the case of who they're going to side with and kind of why. So let's say over the course of that discussion, it could take hours, it could take days, it could take minutes. They decide it's a 5-4 decision on my behalf. And the chief is sides in the 5. So the chief then gets to decide who is going to write the majority opinion. The chief might say, hey, I want to take this one on. Or the chief could say, you know what, let's assign that to somebody else who is in the 5. Let's assign that to Justice Breyer. So Justice Breyer now is given the job of writing the majority opinion for the court, which is basically, here's what the court thinks. Then whoever's in the dissent, who is the senior justice in the dissent, so let's say in this case, Justice Ginsburg does not side in my favor, sides for Kiefer, but it's 5-4, so and she's in the 4. Justice Ginsburg might be the senior justice. And so Justice Ginsburg gets to decide who writes the opinion. She could assign it to herself or she can assign it to somebody else. Oftentimes justices will select folks that care really deeply about that cause, right? So for example, if there's a case dealing with gender equality or sex equality, Justice Ginsburg is going to be assigned to write one of those decisions. That was the work that she did prior to becoming a justice of the Supreme Court. So it just depends on the area. Justice Alito very much loves business law. That was the type of work that he was involved in, but he also really loves sports. And I heard him say, when I heard him speak 2 years ago, Justice Alito said, listen, if I wasn't a Supreme Court justice, I would love to be commissioner of Major League Baseball. And I can totally see him doing that. He loves baseball. So if it's something related to sports or franchises in that regard, I could imagine, the senior justice choosing to give that job to Justice Alito. So anyway, so that it's kind of a complicated answer, but that's how they go about making a decision. And then somebody writes that decision and then they give the decision. The giving of the decision is a very hush-hush process. That's not talked about. People don't know how the court's going to decide. Let me back that up. Okay, the clerks, for the most part, know how the court's going to decide because they're the ones helping the justices write the decisions. But they keep really quiet because that's their job. There's only one other group of people who know how the court decides before it gets released to the press, and that is the folks who work in publications. So all the decisions are typed up, and they are printed to be distributed to the press that come to the building on the day of the decision. And the publication people have been so good at keeping it quiet. There's only been one time in the modern era that the publications folks somehow a secret let out, and it was actually Roe versus Wade. one of the biggest cases in American history. But aside from that, it's usually really hush hush. Most of the time, we don't know how the court's going to decide until the decision day. We are moving down the road by the way of decision days. So I would tell you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you should be watching the news right around 7 a.m. and to see what the court's going to decide. The court has until the last week in June to make all their decisions for the term. So the case, just like the case that came out of Washington State last Wednesday, Chiafalo versus Washington, they're going to decide that by the end of June. And I think that's going to be a really big case. So actually, I think I'm going to stop there. I think I'm going to hold off on these other bullet points and talk about them next week, because I think we've spent a lot of time talking about how a case actually gets to the court. I've introduced some vocab for you, writ certiorari. We've talked about amicus or amicus briefs, precedent and stare decisis. So there's a lot there. And I've talked to you a little bit, give you some insight into the process in which the court makes the decision. If you ever have any questions, just like curiosity stuff that you want to know about the Supreme Court, seriously, send it my way. You know that I love this stuff. I've been fortunate enough to hear the Supreme Court decide some cases. I've been in the room where it happens. I've talked to 2 Supreme Court justices and had lunch with 4 of their clerks. So I feel like I have this really cool level of engagement with the Supreme Court in ways that just the average person doesn't. And it's only because of the summer programs that I attend. I love this stuff. So anyway, any questions you have, shift them my way. I'm happy to answer them for you. And I look forward to seeing the questions that you have.